Welcome, Isabel Molina-Guzmán from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, who is professor of Latinx Studies, Latinx TV, pop culture, but also a dean there at the university. Welcome, Isabel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're going to talk about you and like all the cool, amazing things that you've been able to accomplish and fields that you've opened and research projects and programs of new generations that are now following in your sort of in those doors that you've opened for us. But why danger? Okay, so dangerous curves. Like, how did you you just like, this is, I'm going to write about this? Or yeah, tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, no, that was, so I actually had, when I started working on this book, I had decided I was leaving academia. I was stepping out of a tenure track job because I'm like, oh, I don't want to do the publish and perish thing. And I took a job as communications director at a nonprofit firm. And as I was doing that job, of course, I was still consuming popular culture and going to the movies and keeping up with the news as I always do. And I realized that, there had been a shift in terms of the ways, the presence of Latinas in both the news and in television and film at the time. And I kind of was really interested in that. Like, oh my gosh, oops, apologies for that. Sorry for that, Fede. I forgot to turn my phone on. So, so I was, and Elian Gonzalez was happening, and I was like watching reading the news and watching the news, and, and the whole story captivated me. And I just kind of thought, this is such an interesting moment, like where we have this visibility both in news and in film and television in ways we've never had it before. And I was intrigued by why. Why is that the case? Why is that happening? And while I was doing my nonprofit job, I started doing research and ended up writing about Salma Hayek and Jennifer Lopez at the time, which were the two big Latina actresses in Hollywood films. And I ran into a colleague who was working on a similar project, and we kind of got together and collaborated on that project. And then I just kept researching what was happening and realized, okay, I'm horrible at this 9-to-5 thing. Obviously, I'm really bad. So maybe I should go back to academia. And I did. And I had a mentor who helped me kind of get back on the tenure track. And I kept working on these projects. I got a Latino Studies postdoc, which enabled me to really kind of finish my writing that I had started while I was working at the nonprofit, and things kept ballooning, right? The representation kept growing, and I continued to be intrigued about it. And we had Ugly Betty, and then on and on and on. And that's how the book got written. I just really was out of that, my interest in consuming popular culture and noticing that there was this rise and wanting to understand why and what the potential consequences were of that. So for Latino audiences and the Latino population as a whole. So.
Yeah, no, really important work. Also, there are different ways that we can approach representation. And it was also really fresh and vital to have someone kind of bringing a kind of audience response, kind of data kind of approach to the work, and not just I'm not saying not just because I do this, but a kind of cultural studies representation approach. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's always been one of my favorite parts of I actually, my first love is ethnographic research, is talking to people. And I knew I couldn't talk to people per se with this project, but I wanted to try to get at what it was that people were saying. And so as I was thinking through these texts, I was researching what entertainment writers, particularly in the case of movies, were writing both in the US and outside the US, and trying to keep track of what audiences were doing and saying in the comments and user groups and fan groups. And so that kind of gave me a sense of some of the responses by audiences at the time. And it allowed me to contextualize my readings of the text in ways that that really, I thought, helped me to be more nuanced about how I understood why these texts were significant, and also the limits of them for audiences, right? The ways in which audiences saw them as not really, some audiences saw them as not really being the presentations they wanted about themselves. And so, for me, that's always been really an important part of the work that I do. And that's one of the sort of my next project, is really trying to go back to trying to interview both producers as well as, so both content creators, but also more audiences in terms of how they're experiencing the kinds of images that they're seeing, trying to conduct more interviews, and which I love. I love talking to people. So
yeah, me too. Latinx I am so just beyond happy and so excited about your Latinas and Latinos on TV. It's been out now for a little bit, but that it's in my pop culture series is remarkable, right? Tell us a little bit about that one, because it's different, right? It's different.
It is. It's different. It's focused on a particular medium, right? It's focused on television, and I really tried to take an industry approach to the book, right? Trying to understand how the sort of mainstream television industry, the networks or the cable productions of television content, trying to understand the sort of constraints created on the production side and how they shape the content that we eventually see. And so that was a different, trying to shift to sort of understanding the behind the camera politics around race and gender and sexuality, and how it shaped the on-screen images and narratives that we see, at least through what are some of the most popular shows we've had in television history, right? Modern Family being one of the key ones. And so that was very different for me to do that. And it really started with my work on Islas High, which I'm hoping to write about for one of your next books. And so, so it started with the talk I did on Islas High with some of the producers for that show, where we talked about the industry and why that show, the Hulu show that was produced, by this independent production company, was so important for young Latina audiences in particular. And that got me thinking then to go back and kind of think through how production shaped all of these other texts, and in both good and not so good ways. And so I loved it. It was a fun project, and I'm really glad I got the opportunity to publish it under your series. I thought it was a perfect fit for that series. That was just a perfect confluence of events, and I really like that book. It's little but mighty. So
yeah, those concepts like hipster racism, things that I know have been really useful for me, but also for my students, and I'm sure you found that as well, right? That kind of distilling into a concept something that's sort of powerfully generating kind of story in these television spaces, right?
It is. Yeah.
Could you give us an example of, I don't know, a TV show and maybe hipster racism in operation? Just off your head.
Well, of course, yeah. The main one is, the one I talk about the most is Modern Family. Modern Family, that's part of the reason it's so popular. It's fueled by it. and Gloria, the main character played by Sofia Vergara, is often the brunt of it. And and one of my favorite examples, it's from 2 or 3 seasons ago when she's pregnant, and I talk about this in the book, and she shows up in a green alien costume, and a guest in the show starts to comment on how he loves her costume, and she right away starts like reading him the riot card, like, why are you saying this? Because I'm Latina? Because you think I'm undocumented? Which of course in the history of the show, she was undocumented. Because you think I'm undocumented because of blah, 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 blah. And her husband pulls her aside. He's like, you need to calm down, because all he was doing was commenting you on your show. And let me remind you, you were illegal, and et cetera, et cetera. And then he starts like, his calming down is actually more offensive than anything that had happened previously, right? The sort of, he occupies this very like white paternal figure, trying to calm her down by drawing attention to the fact that you were illegal. You're acting because you're being an irrational pregnant woman. It's like, oh, really? Like just all of the stereotypes, right, around women and Latinas. And, and so that's a perfect example of hipster racism. And it's so easy to find. It's interesting because when I see, there's been some reviews. I was just updating my CV, so I was looking around to see like, oh, who's reviewed the book, and I found a couple of like on websites, and that was one of the comments, the key comments. It's like, this hipster racism. Now I can't watch any shows without thinking about it, because you realize that so much of the humor in films and Hollywood television content, mm-hmm. especially contemporary humor, is really fueled in that way, in this double-edged way that you can read it in multiple ways. And mm-hmm. some might think it's funny, and others might be like, ooh, that's a little ouchy, right? Like, I can't, that's a little, that's really hitting a stereotype there that I'm a little uncomfortable with. And, and I think first The Office, in the US, and then Modern Family really has pioneered that humor.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's kind of like, we see these woke kind of writers and showrunners, but then like there's these slips that kind of reveal the kind of real, right?
Yeah, real. Yeah, and that's ultimately, the critique of Modern Family for me is that their writer's room is just not diverse. It was never meant to be diverse. It was meant to be this like really the story told through heteronormative, white upper middle class, white producers, white writers in Hollywood. That was the intent of that show, to talk about their experiences. But of course, as you and I know, they have to diversify the cast in order to try to attract a broader audience base. But they're still writing from that sensibility, which is very different, for instance, in Latino produced shows, or shows that are produced by, trans writers and GLBTQ writers and African-American writers. I mean, the narratives are different. The humor is different. It's more nuanced. It's still funny as all get out, but it doesn't, and it still like takes those jabs, but not at necessarily communities that are already vulnerable. It just, the humor is so much more complicated. So you really see the difference between these shows that are produced by the same type of people who have been writing them for decades, and then shows where you're really getting an introduction of new voices that are finally being able to tell stories in a way that's different and compelling and funny. And so it's really interesting, this time we're living in right now.
It's sort of, in a way, you've kind of maybe even begun to answer this next question about why, the study and teaching of Latinx pop culture or TV matters. And, Hintified, On My Block, the Shavida, other shows, there is something radically different, right? I mean, like you were saying, I mean, the writing to maybe a Latinx audience instead of a kind of idealized white woke audience. But yeah, I don't know, maybe you can share a little bit about a kind of our contemporary moment, but also, yeah, why this actually matters, why teaching this stuff is important.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, I had to explain to my 8-year-old what I do for a living. And I'm like, well, mommy teaches people about film and television. And she's like, what? And I'm like, well, I teach them why it's important so that they are able to understand, to kind of view the culture around them in a way that's critically informed, because it's fueled by inequality and also fuels inequality. And so he's like, so it's not fair? And I'm like, yeah, it's kind of not fair. And I think that's why it's important, right? That I think it's important for people to understand that it matters who's telling the stories. And not that you can't enjoy stories that aren't produced by people who aren't from those communities, because you can, and I do. I think Modern Family is funny. I think, all the shows I write about, I watch and I think are funny and I chuckle. And that is part of the reason why I'm interested, right? Because then I think about like, ooh, am I laughing at this? But, I think it's important for students to understand what goes into making those shows and how it's already unequal, right? It's already setting up relationships of inequality on the production side that then shapes the kinds of texts that get produced. And so as consumers, we grow up in a culture where we come to understand inequality as well, right? We know that not everyone is treated the same. And so it's important for them to put that together, right? How these shows are both fueled by their own inequalities within how they're made, but they're also sent out into a culture that's defined by inequality as well. And so how those texts are consumed then can be particularly, how we as audiences make sense and use those texts can be really important. Can be, can either reinforce someone's stereotypic attitudes about the communities that are represented, or can be self-reaffirming for communities who have been erased. And so, but you really for me, you have to put that together, right? You have to, and so I think it's so important to teach about television, to teach about film, to teach about all of the kinds of media that we consume in that critical way, so that people understand, how it's shaped by potential inequality in terms of its making, but also in terms of how audiences make sense of it and how it really connects to our broader culture in ways that are potentially negative, and that it allows people to continue to hold values that are maybe racist or sexist or homophobic, and also in the way that it potentially provides moments of pleasure and release and recognition to communities that are often erased. So that's why I think it's important. And I don't know, I think it's fun to teach about, of course, these contents, but I also think it's actually really socially and politically important as well.
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to take that little clip and have that at the very beginning of all of my Latinx courses so that they hear it straight from Isabel.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we've kind of talked a little bit about this. It is surprising to me, that, gosh, we are the majority historically underrepresented in this country.
Yep.
And yet, we're still kind of not represented. And when we are represented, and this is, I'm talking about shows that are not where you don't have a Latinx, Latino, Latina in sight anywhere, we're still like pretty stereotypically kind of presented. I don't know how does it, can you sleep at night? I don't know,
Sometimes, whenever I teach this, it's always really like gut churning, and I share the data with students on, there are all these wonderful report cards that come out from the, National Association of, National Association of Coalition of Latina Media Producers. I forget the initials that it stands for, but they put out a TV report card. USCLA and USC put out diversity report cards as well. And it all comes down to the fact that over the last, I don't know, since we got film and television, right? Like 1920s for film, 1940s, 50s for television, there are hardly any writers of color, and even less Latino writers, right? Like African American writers and producers are still underrepresented, and yet they are like, I don't know, 5 percentage points ahead of where Latinos are, and then Asian American producers and Native American producers, forget it. And so, I think that's why we are so underrepresented. Like, we are not part of the industry in ways that we're able to make a difference. And that part is really, to me, when you think about that part really makes me upset. Because that's just straight up like structural racism in play, right? That's an industry that has a serious race and gender problem, although it's doing better with gender, and has done nothing to address it. And it's not because there's a lack of Latino writers. That's not the case. The talent is there. The actors are there. The producers are there. There's people graduating from film school. There's excellent writers out there. It's because they're not part of that network. And that's wrong. And so I love to present, when I talk about, the lack of representation, I love to share that data with students to encourage them to think about the importance of why the creative industries matter, why it matters to become, to think about being artists, to think about being producers, movie makers, script writers, because it matters to have those voices in the industry, at the same time that we need to make our voices heard with the people that control the means of production. And I think they're slowly getting it, but it's slow. And until they start really responding to that, to the fact that they need to open up the creative doors to allow for a bigger diversity of voices, we're not going to see those numbers change.
Yeah. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but is there a particular kind of, I don't know, something that you do in the class? Because I know the students love you, you're sort of award-winning teacher. Is there something that is a trademark Isabel kind of thing that you do in the classroom to just, take the students somewhere new, or is there something?
Well, I mean, I think my 2 favorite techniques is having them do, so I have them usually, we do a lot of discussion, of course, even in the large lecture course, and just having them kind of sit through and in class analyze a scene, or, and then share their sort of analysis with others. And that usually is such a great eye-opening thing, especially when you have a diverse classroom where where you have, maybe like 20-30% underrepresented students, maybe 30% underrepresented students, which is big, right, for a predominantly white institution. And then you have, 50-60% white and some Asian students and some others mixed in there. And to have everyone sitting around the table sharing their readings of one particular scene with each other is really eye-opening for the students to see that, oh, what I thought was funny, somebody else didn't think was funny, or what I thought was a good representation, somebody else actually was really upset by. And sometimes in very unexpected ways, like we saw, I'm forgetting the name of that movie with uh, with, I think it's Judy Reyes, about the transgender kid. What's the name of that movie? Forgetting it now. Oh, such a good movie. We were in a class that was fairly diverse along those lines, and there was a white kid who spoke up, and he was like very Catholic, but sort of my reading of him was that he was going to be fairly conservative. And then we saw that movie Gun Hill Road. We saw that movie, and we saw that movie, and he was like, wow, it was really hard for me to watch, to see the violence inflicted on the transgender kid, because my best friend is transgender, and I couldn't stop thinking about that. And it just opened up such a great conversation in class about that in these unexpected ways. And so for me, those are my favorite moments. And the other thing that I love to do, which the students love, is actually not forcing them, but assigning them to make their own movies. And, while trying to avoid the stereotypic tropes that are often used to tell stories. And that is usually a lot of fun, because you get some really creative, you get them producing some really creative content, but also how hard it is to tell a story in a short amount of time without relying on stereotypes. And so those are probably two of my favorite exercises that I think students really enjoy and unexpectedly get a lot out of without expecting to, right? Because students love to make movies, and so they don't expect that they're going to actually that making a movie is going to be so hard to avoid kind of a standard practice that's used in every movie. And so it allows them to kind of have a different perspective on the role of stereotypes in films and television shows, and why they're so hard, and also why it's important to have other voices at the table.
Yeah. And the work involved, right? The work.
Yeah. And it's so hard, right? If you're told you can't use any of the, it has to be a story, usually during my Latino film class, right? So it's like, a story relevant to what we've been talking about. It can be fictional, it can be, documentary style, but you can't rely on stereotypic tropes to avoid them. And so, I mean, the films are great. I love them. I mean, I actually, haven't done it yet, but want to use them in my classes, because I think they're so clever. But they also, the comment is, it was really hard to do, really hard to make a film, and then really hard to make one that avoided stereotypes, that avoided stereotypic tropes in the making of it, because they're so used to, you were so used to telling stories in that way. So visual stories. Say.
So the kind of $1 million question for 2020, the Super Bowl 2020 halftime performances, how did you respond?
I couldn't believe it, frankly. I was like, this is it was like night and day, because I would talk, I was talking to I'm not a football fan, so I do watch the commercials afterwards, but I don't generally watch the game, but my parents do and my sisters do. And so they were calling me that night like, oh my gosh, did you see Shakira and J-Lo? They looked fabulous. Oh my gosh, they were so awesome. They were like, they're so, it was a great show. And then I wake up the next morning and I see, that there was a protest movement against what they were wearing. And I was like, wow, I couldn't believe it. I mean, it's so interesting for a whole range of reasons, right? Women of color are always hypersexualized, number one. So why was it so inappropriate that this is how they chose to represent themselves, or not, right? Like, we don't know. Like, their handlers may have insisted, but more than likely they were sort of, participants in how they costumed themselves. But, it's not like it's a particularly unusual representation to see, right? Like, this is usually how we see Latinos represented, in these very hypersexualized ways. And so, but I think, for me, I have to assume that it was the fact that you had two women of color, two Latinas, two gorgeous Latinas with amazing bodies, right, doing their thing during the halftime show of one of the America's most iconically, revered moments, right, where you're supposed to have, I think, this affirmation of whiteness, of like, of white culture, ironically enough, even though there are hardly any white players in the game, right? And the audiences for the NFL are quite, very diverse, right? Everyone watches, across all categories, watch football. And so, but I think for a lot of those white audiences, it was really disruptive to see these two Latina women doing their thing during, I guess, during this moment. And I think, especially in the context of the Trump era, right, where we've gotten like really cultivated this anti-Latino attitude. Yeah, it was the perfect dynamite. I mean, because literally, like, all of the Latino audiences that I know watched the show, were like, they were so like, it was amazing. It was the best halftime show. I can't believe how good J-Lo looks. Shakira looked amazing. It's like, and then I literally wake up the next day, I'm like, what? There's a protest?
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
people are protesting the halftime show? Okay.
So. As we kind of wrap this up, Isabel, so I know in another space you talked about the kind of vitality and kind of analog modes of creation, and new generations kind of going to zines and things like that. And it got me thinking too that it does seem to be that television and Latinx, at least the Netflix platform and other streaming platforms, there's a real sense of young people, young Latinxes, and their complexity and their complex ranges of emotions and thoughts and complex experiences that are now finally kind of making their way into the television space. But yeah, on my blog comes to mind Hentified, but maybe there's something for you too that's just kind of a special, especially interesting, or that jumps out for you.
Yeah, I mean, I have not that much time, unfortunately, to watch as much television or streaming as I would like because of my 8-year-old. But probably, I mean, for me, as I mentioned earlier, one of the more exciting things about the kinds of representations that we're seeing on these various platforms is the diversity of Latino, Latinx experiences that are being represented. And, I'll give you one again from a sort of mainstream, from a mainstream platform, Charmed. I know there was a lot of controversy around that show because of the casting, right? But I think the fact that the three characters are clearly Latinas, and one of them is queer, she's a lesbian, and the other, like, non-Latina actress is representing an Afro-Latina, and I'm thinking, that is pretty, for a mainstream kind of television show, that representation of Latinidad is outside the box. And I think, two of the actresses are actually mixed race, and so the fact that that you have this, Latinas who look very different from the J-Los or the Shakiras, and whose experiences are also very different from, the sort of heteronormative narratives that we often get about Latina women in particular, about Latinas in particular. is really fun. Like I love, and it's, I've been looking, what I'm looking at with that show is the user comments and how crazy fans of the original show are, because it isn't white women or the same white women representing those characters. And so it gives you a sense of how radical it can be to really, change narratives in this way, right? They made one of the characters a lesbian, none of the characters are white, and so fans of the original show hate it because of that. And at the same time, it's opened up reception for audiences who, who again don't generally see themselves and might not have turned into that show, but are really like this reboot of this kind of iconic American show from the 90s and early 2000s. And so, so that's, I think, an example of the way that opening up the writer, the creator for that show was the same creator that did Jane the Virgin. And she's not Latina, but she brought on a very diverse writing team and a very diverse production team for that show. Mm. And so I think that's the power of, again, diversifying who's telling the story, and then, opening up what kinds of stories you get to tell, and how to do it in a way that's really compelling to audiences. And for me, that's a perfect example of that, right? Like she, the creator of the show, was really smart about how she has tried to create this very different kind of story featuring characters that you don't normally get to see.
Yeah, that's great. Wow, thanks, Isabel Molina-Guzmán. Thank you for joining me for a video cast on Professor Latinx.
No problem. It was my pleasure, Freddie, as always.
Thank you, and we'll be in touch.
Yep, definitely. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.